Hi class, my name is Andrew and I'll be presenting for my group. My group unintentionally combined two groups for this project and didn't catch the mistake until it was a little too late to break the group up. The two groups we combined were Group 1 and Group 3, but only 5 members of the two groups ended up responding and participating in this project, so I think it worked out in the end. Our group chose to argue against prisons permitting special accommodations for Pastafarianism. Savannah Hawkins provided the background information. Yard Estrada's role was to identify the belief system of the FMS religion. Samantha Perez formulated our argument against prisons accommodating Pastafarianism. David Sanchez identified the counterargument and argued against it. And I combined all of our work into a coherent presentation and will now present our argument. Our class has been tasked with arguing for or against the accommodation of Pastafarianism in the prison system. I will begin by explaining the situation our textbook describes and some history of why Bobby Henderson created FSM. Henderson is a physicist who obtained a bachelor's degree from the University of Oregon. He was 25 when he created the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. Though the movement began as a satirical argument in favor of science and against teaching creationism in public schools, it quickly grew into a serious means of fighting for our First Amendment rights. The followers of this religion have had religious statues removed and flying spaghetti monster statues put up next to other religious statues that the government has refused to remove. The book explains that after pressure from religious groups, in 2005, the Kansas School Board of Education gave preliminary approval for new policies. These policies mandated public school science teachers to present intelligent design, quote, as an equally plausible explanation for natural selection and human development, unquote. Bobby Henderson decided to respond by writing a letter to the Kansas School Board asking for equal recognition of an all-powerful deity called the Flying Spaghetti Monster that he claims created the world. In Bobby Henderson's open letter to the school board, he stated, quote, "We have evidence that the Flying Spaghetti Monster created the universe. None of us, of course, were around to see it, but we have written accounts of it," unquote. While his letter was clearly satirical, Bobby kept a straight face while arguing his case that if schools are teaching the theory of intelligent design and evolution, then students need to learn other theories so that they may choose for themselves of what they believe in or what creation story makes the most sense to them. He argued that since there was no religion or person around to witness the creation of the earth, the belief in Christianity is just as valid as the belief in a flying spaghetti monster, thus presenting the Flying Spaghetti Monster as an equally plausible theory of creation. Since Bobby never received a reply from the Kansas School Board, he decided to post his letter that argued other theories of creation should be taught alongside intelligent design and evolution theory to his website. As a result of this post, the Pastafarianism religion began to grow. They eventually created a Pastafarian doctrine, complete with its own dogma, a holy book, and a fully formulated creation myth. Pastafarians believe in a creator god that they call the Flying Spaghetti Monster. He is a floating chunk of spaghetti with 2 eyeballs made out of meatballs. The Flying Spaghetti Monster created the universe, so they believe, 5,000 years ago, with no one around to witness it. They believe the Flying Spaghetti Monster created the Earth in 0.062831853 seconds. FSM, or the Flying Spaghetti Monster, knew that when the world grew older, there would be lots of curious scientists, so he placed dinosaur fossils in the ground for them to unearth. The Flying Spaghetti Monster admired the pirates for their lifestyle, and he made them his chosen ones. Flying Spaghetti Monster told them to hand down the message on how humans should live, and the pirates embodied this way of life. Pastafarians don't see their God as an embodiment of perfection as other religions do. Instead, they believe he was a careless and cruel drunk who gets high and has many other imperfections. Like other religions, they too believe in an afterlife, or heaven if you will. But their heaven looks slightly different than what most of us envision when imagining the pearly gates. The Pastafarian heaven isn't your typical clouds and sun rays with no sin and angels floating around. It's a tropical land with strippers and debauchery. But those who forsake or don't recognize the flying spaghetti monster will go to hell, which is similar to heaven, but the strippers have venereal diseases and the beer is stale, so not so good. The Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster is willing to change its beliefs based on new evidence or any other new or deeply analyzed evidence from older evidence to convince Pastafarians that there is no such thing as a flying spaghetti monster. All one must do is prove his non-existence, which we all know it's impossible to prove the non-existence of something that is intangible. As opposed to commandments, the Pastafarians have 8 statements known as the "I'd really rather wish you didn't." These statements encourage Pastafarians not to judge anyone based on their looks, see both genders as equal, and not view anyone as superior to anyone else, unless of course they have a better sense of fashion than you. Anyone can convert to Pastafarianism. All you need to do is educate yourself about the religious doctrine and decide whether you want to be a part of it. They would also like their followers to encourage conversion to Pastafarianism by knocking on doors at 5 o'clock with soda offerings and chat about his holy noodliness, the flying spaghetti monster. When a couple wanted to marry under the flying spaghetti monster religion, both couples had to wear full pirate regalia. Then, with one end of the noodle in each of their mouths, they ate the noodle until their mouths met in a kiss. Oh, how cute. I find this all to be very amusing, and I think it brings up an excellent point about the separation of church and state. But that doesn't mean that I believe they went about it in the right way, or that prisons should accommodate Pastafarianism. I'll get to my point of view a little bit later, but for now let's move on to the argument that my partner Samantha formulated, and I edited to fit the speech. The following is why she thinks prisons shouldn't accommodate Pastafarianism. During 2016, on April 12th, the question, should the flying spaghetti monster religion be accommodated in prisons, arose. In the court case of Kavanaugh versus Bartelt, Kavanaugh files a claim stating that he was being discriminated against because he was not allowed to practice his religion and the other inmates were. Although everyone's rights entail freedom of religion, and one's belief systems shouldn't be held higher than another, prisons shouldn't accommodate this so-called religion. Kavanaugh demands financial retribution because the guards wouldn't allow him to practice Pastafarianism in the penitentiary facility. But Kavanaugh didn't give any detailed accounts of the religious requirements of FSMism to help support his case. If prisons were to accommodate the Pastafarian religion, it would require allowing a myriad of special privileges, some of which include wearing full pirate regalia while proselytizing to other inmates, the right to a seaworthy vessel, treatment of Fridays as a holiday, and wearing a colander of goodness on their heads. But since inmates have limited rights, and this is far above what any inmate could reasonably demand, there isn't any valid reasoning within his demands, which gives substance to his claims, and he doesn't fully articulate what he is asking for. He just gives religious names. Inmates could take his belief as a joke. Inmates could take his belief as a joke and may resort to demanding ridiculous accommodations as well. Another reason prisons can't accommodate Pastafarianism is that serious followers of legitimate religions could find the satirical display to be offensive, and they may feel as if he is mocking their faith. Pastafarianism entails many difficult to accommodate traditions, such as their Sabbath Fridays, where they drink beer and relax, or Ramadan, where a month-long celebration around March or April, where they restrict themselves to a noodle-only diet. They are also required to dress as pirates while celebrating. These traditions are all fine and dandy when you're free and in society, but it wouldn't be practical to accommodate such things in a penitentiary facility. In Kavanaugh versus Bartlett case, the court overruled the ruling of RLUIPA for not meeting its requirements. The U.S. Congress enacted the Religious Land Use and Institutionalization Prisons Act, or RLUIPA, in 2000. The government created the act to protect individuals, churches, or religious institutions from discrimination. RLUIPA can only be denied if the regulations are the least restrictive means to further its interests. The case of Kavanaugh versus Bartlett states, quote, "This case is difficult because FSMism is a parody, is designed to look very much like a religion. Candidly, propositions from existing clauses are not particularly well suited for such a situation because they develop to address more ad hoc, not a comprehensive but plainly satirical doctrine. Nonetheless, it is evident to the court that FSMism is not a belief system addressing deep and imponderable matters. It is, as explained above, a satirical rejoinder of a certain strain of religious argument," unquote. The general idea of the above quote is that although he is well within his rights to believe in Pastafarianism, it cannot be accommodated or recognized by the prisons. The case also states, quote, "A prisoner could just as easily read the works of Vonnegut or Heinlein and claim it as his holy book and demand accommodation," unquote. This quote shows that if prisons accommodated FSMism, future demands could continue to become more outlandish and unreasonable. The final quote that Samantha enjoyed and thought completed her line of thinking was, quote, "But there must be a line between which a practice is not religious simply because a plaintiff labels it as such," unquote. Now let's move on to some counter-arguments against FSMism not being allowed in prisons. David formulated the following argument. The argument that the proponents of Pastafarianism presents are based on freedom of religion. The United States Constitution in the First Amendment states that, quote, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof," unquote. Henderson, the founder of Pastafarianism, encourages others to, quote, "Think of cults or churches where the leaders are scamming their followers out of money. These are groups where the followers fully believe. Are these churches legitimate since they have many true believers?" Or can we argue that religion is as much about community as it is shared faith? By any rational metric, Pastafarians are as legitimate a religious group as any, unquote. Even New Zealand has recognized the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster as authentic since 2016 and allows ordained ministers to perform weddings and funerals. If this is not a real religion, how has it gained so many followers, including those in prisons? In 1890, the Supreme Court in Davis versus Beeson defines religion as, quote, the term religion has reference to one's views of his relation to his Creator and the obligations they impose of reverence for his being and character and of obedience to his will, unquote. Henderson, the founder of Pastafarianism, explains on the official website that the creator of all is the Flying Spaghetti Monster. He documented the decrees of the religion in the Flying Spaghetti Monster Gospel. Some of these decrees include the necessity of wearing a colander on one's head and dressing up like a pirate. These decrees are exactly what Kavanaugh was fighting for when he expressed his disapproval that he was not allowed to practice his religion in prison. In the case of Kavanaugh versus Nebraska, the judge examined these decrees and deemed Pastafarianism was nothing more than a parody religion, based more on science than belief. The judge ruled that, quote, although RLUIPA bars inquiry into whether a particular belief or practice is central to a prisoner's religion, it does not preclude inquiry into the sincerity of a prisoner's professed religiosity. The truth of a belief is not open to question, rather the question is whether the objector's beliefs are truly held, unquote. Prisoners, specifically Kavanaugh, were subject to the guards' discretion regarding whether their beliefs were real. These guards assessed the situation, taking into account the resources needed for Kavanaugh to practice, the effect on other prisoners, and the sincerity of his belief. Based on that, they deemed that the prison placed no substantial burden on him in reference to the practice of his religion. After all, no other prisoners were allowed to wear special clothing or clothing to denote their religion. Instead, all prisoners were to wear only the assigned orange jumpsuit. No prisoners were allowed hats, which means that colanders on the head would have also been disallowed. As denoted by the judge, the main purpose of these was to evangelize to others, not for Kavanaugh's own personal worship of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. Further, courts define religion in three ways. First, religion addresses fundamental and ultimate questions having to do with deep and imponderable matters. Second, a religion is comprehensive in nature. It consists of a belief system as opposed to an isolated teaching. Third, the religion can often be recognized by the presence of certain formal and existing signs. Despite the fact that Pastafarianism does address questions like, quote, who created the universe, unquote, the judge ruled that Pastafarianism did not present questions that dealt with deep and imponderable matters. Whatever deep and imponderable means. The text is not expansive enough and often contradicts itself. On the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster website, Henderson addresses contradictions like these by saying, quote, "A lot of Christians don't believe the Bible is literally true, but that doesn't mean they aren't true Christians. If they say Pastafarians must believe in a literal flying spaghetti monster to be true believers, then you can make a similar argument for Christians. There's a lot of outlandish stuff in the Bible that rational Christians choose to ignore," unquote. However, the teachings still do not address a belief system, as most of the teachings have an isolated focus on what other religions are doing wrong, such as the teaching of intelligent design. The third qualification of religion is to have external and formal signs. The Flying Spaghetti Monster Gospel states that there is to be no formal churches built, but rather the money is to be used to help the poor. In addition, Henderson argues throughout his statement that you don't have to believe to be a follower, but that in time you may come to believe parts of the gospel or all of it. It is very much up to the individual. And so the title of follower is loosely applied to anyone who wishes to claim it. This invalidates Pastafarianism as a religion in a court of law. In 2017, the Attorney General penned a memorandum for all executive departments and agencies entitled Federal Law Protection for Religious Liberty. In this memorandum, he states, quote, "Religious liberty is not merely a right to personal religious beliefs or even to worship in a sacred place. It also encompasses religious observance and practice, except in the narrowest circumstances. No one should be forced to choose between living out his or her faith and complying with the law. Therefore, to the greatest extent practicable and permitted by law, religious observance and practice should be reasonably accommodated in all government activities, including employment, contracting, and programming," unquote. The narrowest sense of circumstances in the above quote refers to a parody religion that prisoners seek to practice in prisons. They are still able to believe and practice their belief, since the belief system is so flexible. They do not lose their religion just because they can't wear certain clothing or take communion in a certain way. They are in no way substantially burdened by the prison system and therefore do not deserve to be accommodated. Okay, now that ends David's presentation of the counter-argument and his rebuttal to it. But before I close our argument, I would like to state my stance on this issue and hopefully offer a different reason why prisons shouldn't accommodate Pastafarianism. My line of thinking on this topic is quite different than the way most people would approach it. My group has argued that prisons shouldn't accommodate Pastafarianism. I would agree with this stance, but not in the same way that my group has claimed. I would take this argument a step further and say that the state shouldn't accommodate any religions in prison. The religious should be free to exercise and express their faith, as long as it does not require them to break any rules or receive special treatment above the non-religious. The First Amendment states, 1. Quote, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion," unquote, which is known as the Establishment Clause, and 2. Quote, "prohibiting the free exercise thereof," unquote, which is known as the Free Exercise Clause. The Establishment Clause not only means that the government will not establish a state religion and that the government will not favor one religion over another, but It also means that the government will not favor the religious over the non-religious. This is only possible if the United States government is entirely secular. A proper and secular government would only recognize religions to avoid funding religious activities, which would not require lengthy decision-making processes.
Power on. Bluetooth pairing. Bluetooth connected.
Sorry guys, my speaker just shut off. I had to turn it back on. Okay, where was it? A proper secular government would not only recognize would only recognize religions to avoid funding religious activities, which would not require lengthy decision-making process about who is or is not a real religion. The state would only need to evaluate government-funded groups to ensure that they aren't funding evangelization or participation in religious activities. If the government didn't favor the religious over the non-religious, or vice versa, an incarcerated religious member would have the same privileges as someone who has no religion. Therefore, if the government correctly separated church and state, the whole Pastafarianism issue would be irrelevant. To argue against this, some may bring up the Free Exercise Clause, which states that Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of a religion, or the Free Speech Clause. But although prisoners do retain some constitutional rights, they are limited to rights that do not interfere with their status as an inmate. And I would argue that religious accommodations that require better or unique treatment above non-religious inmates interferes with your status as an inmate. However, the government shouldn't stop prisoners from praying, chanting, performing religious rituals unless they violate objective rules that are fairly applied to all prisoners. I'll concretize my point with an example. I'm an atheist, and I have spiritual needs, just like the next person. My spiritual needs entail finding a quiet place to read every night, having good friendships, having a healthy romantic relationship, sex, art, good literature, podcasts, and the list goes on. But if I land myself in jail, I will lose most, if not all, of these spiritual needs. I believe this would leave me spiritually bankrupt. But obviously, prisons can't give me special treatment by accommodating my spiritual needs. This is one of the downfalls of committing a crime. That is not to say everyone in our prison/jail system deserves to be there, or that there isn't room for rehabilitation. But that is a separate issue, and either way, the government shouldn't give religious rehabilitation primacy over secular rehabilitation. Some may say, but religion is important and vital to rehabilitation. I reject this statement and find it hard to believe that anything make-believe can be vital to rehabilitation. Although I do understand that they don't think of their religion as make-believe, and they have every right to have their opinion about what is beneficial or harmful. But even if the statement that religion is important to some and helps them is true, you can't say that it is more important than the things a non-believer holds to be necessary, vital, and beneficial to their lives. At the end of the day, religious freedom is not more important than any secular right. And in fact, religious freedom is a secular right in the way that only a secular government can genuinely uphold it. All rights are inalienable, which means they cannot be taken away. If you break into my home, attempting to hurt my family, and I use force to stop or even kill you, I have not taken away your right to life. You have forfeited your rights by threatening my family and myself's right to life. This is applicable in the prison system as well. Obviously, not all prisoners have used aggression against someone, but those prisoners shouldn't be there, and all of their rights should still be intact. But the fact remains that non-religious persons' spiritual needs aren't any less tangible, defendable, and inalienable than the freedom of religion. They're all protected equally under a secular, free, and proper government. And if we didn't violate those rights by throwing people in jail or prison for victimless crimes, then there would be nothing wrong with restricting an inmate's spiritual needs, religious or otherwise, when those spiritual needs violate fair and objectively set prison rules. Although my stance on this issue is that prisons shouldn't accommodate any religions beyond the limited freedoms offered to everyone else. Suppose the government continues to grant religion a higher status over non-religion. In that case, I'm almost on the side of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, Baphomet, and any other requested deity sitting next to every cross and 10 commandments on state statue on public land, and the prisons making equal accommodations for any religion, no matter how ridiculous, and with the only barrier being that they say their religion. This would be more equal, but I still think it would be immoral, because it would still give religion primacy over non-religion. The religious have the right to religious freedom in the same way that we all have the right to free speech, in the same way that one has the right to be an atheist or environmentalist or a follower of any belief system. It is not an elevated or special right that you only have access to if you join an organized religion. It isn't the government's job to go around deciding who's invisible, man, God, or flying spaghetti monster in the sky is valid and recognized by the state, so they can dole out privileges to the real ones and tell the rest of society that somehow their values are less important. This point further enunciates one of the many reasons why there is supposed to and should be a complete separation of church and state, and why the government has no business favoring non-religion over religion, or why the government has no business favoring religion over non-religion or one religion over another religion. Therefore, if we keep religious matters out of the government discussion, aside from making sure that the state isn't supporting religion implicitly or explicitly, we wouldn't need to bother with tedious questions like, should Pastafarianism be accommodated in prisons? Or is Pastafarianism a real religion? That would be up to the individual to decide. In conclusion, my group has argued that Pastafarianism shouldn't be accommodated in prisons. As an addendum to my group's argument, I have added the clause that prisons shouldn't accommodate any religion. My group and I hold different opinions on this issue, but I do hope that I have given their point of view justice and presented their ideas correctly. Thank you, and that concludes our group's presentation.